Why did a century of aviation excellence collapse into a $20 billion corporate disaster? Today, we are analyzing the Boeing 737 MAX crisis and the systemic rot within one of the world's most important engineering firms to see exactly where the math, the safety protocols, and the corporate culture fell apart. By the end of this investigation, you will understand the silent killer variable, the specific software logic that Boeing hid from pilots to save money, and how that single decision created a structural flaw that no amount of pilot skill could overcome. Most people think these plane crashes were caused by a simple technical glitch. They weren't. They were caused by a fundamental shift in the company's DNA, a transition from an engineering-first culture to a finance-first culture. Pouring billions into stock buybacks doesn't make an airplane safer, and today I'll show you the blueprints of how Boeing's greed overrode its engineering. If you are fascinated by the hidden flaws in massive infrastructure and the cost of cutting corners in high-stakes manufacturing, you are in the right place. Subscribe, because every collapsed legacy leaves a blueprint, and we're here to decode it. I've always been fascinated by the physics of flight, where a single degree of sensor misalignment can be the difference between a smooth cruise and a catastrophic dive. Once you understand the mechanics of the 737 MAX, the disaster starts to make total sense, and the horror of it becomes even more apparent. To understand the collapse of Boeing's reputation, we have to look at the engineering fundamentals of the 737 airframe. The 737 first flew in 1967. It was designed to be low to the ground so that small airports in developing nations could load luggage without specialized equipment. But 50 years later, when Boeing needed to compete with the new fuel-efficient Airbus A320neo, they had a problem. They needed to fit much larger, more efficient engines onto an airframe that was never designed for them. This is where the physics of the disaster begins. Imagine a classic car where you try to install a massive modern truck engine. Because the 737 sits so low, the new, larger engines wouldn't fit under the wings. Boeing's solution was to move the engines further forward and higher up on the wing. But here is the most terrifying detail the engineers realized during wind tunnel testing. This new placement changed the aerodynamics of the plane. Under certain high-thrust conditions, the nose of the plane had a natural tendency to pitch upward. If a plane pitches up too far, it stalls and falls out of the sky. Watch what happens when you try to fight the laws of aerodynamics with a lines of code fix. Visualizing the internal mechanics, you would see the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS. This was a software patch designed to automatically push the nose down if it sensed the plane was stalling when it wasn't. It would force the nose down, over and over again. And here is the hubris that defined this disaster. Boeing purposely downplayed the existence of MCAS to the FAA and to airlines. Why? Because if MCAS was considered a major new system, pilots would be required to undergo expensive simulator training. By calling it a minor software tweak, Boeing saved airlines millions of dollars per plane. They prioritized the spreadsheet over the cockpit. Let's look at the actual blueprints of the corporate merger that started this rot. In 1997, Boeing merged with its struggling rival, McDonnell Douglas. Internally, employees joked that McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with Boeing's own money. The culture shifted from engineers who happened to make money to accountants who happened to make planes. The headquarters was moved from Seattle, where the engineers were, to Chicago, and later Virginia to be closer to lobbyists and financiers. This creates a massive retention spike in investigative interest because it shows that a disaster doesn't start on the assembly line, it starts in the boardroom. The engineers who raised concerns about the 737 MAX's stability were reportedly told to keep quiet or were ignored in favor of meeting aggressive production schedules. Here's what most people get wrong about this disaster, and it's a point that men who value technical truth need to hear. After the first crash of Lion Air Flight 610, Boeing and some industry analysts tried to blame pilot error and lack of training in developing nations. This was a powerful myth, but it was busted by the second crash, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. The autopsy of the flight data showed that even when the pilots followed Boeing's emergency procedures to the letter, the software was so aggressive and the mechanical forces on the trim wheel were so high that they could not manually pull the nose back up. The plane was literally fighting the humans for control, and because of the software's design, the plane won. The concrete of Boeing's reputation didn't fail because of bad pilots. It failed because the design trapped the pilots in a situation that was mathematically impossible to survive. From a physics standpoint, the 737 MAX was an aerodynamic compromise managed by a software workaround. When you ignore the basic engineering principle that software should assist the pilot, not override them without their knowledge, you invite catastrophe. This matters today because the rot at Boeing didn't stop with the 737 MAX grounding. In 2024, we saw a door plug blow out of a brand new Alaska Airlines flight. The investigation into that incident revealed that the bolts were simply never installed at the factory. This is where the math of outsourcing falls apart. Boeing outsourced major structural components to third-party contractors like Spirit Aerospace to cut costs, but in doing so, they lost control over the quality of their own blueprints. Most people don't realize the physics of corporate momentum at play here. When a company stops being an engineering firm and starts being a financial instrument, the safety margins don't just shrink, they disappear. According to the structural reports and internal whistleblowers, the production line was a house of cards, with workers pressured to ignore defects to keep the line moving. The autopsy of the disaster shows that Boeing spent over $40 billion on stock buybacks in the decade leading up to the MAX crisis, money that could have been used to develop a completely new clean sheet aircraft that wouldn't have needed the MCAS software patch in the first place. This makes the video feel urgent and relevant because if you fly today, you are a passenger in a system built on these compromises. The reason this $20 billion disaster and the thousands of lives impacted matters is that it serves as the ultimate warning for the 21st century. You cannot Lean Six Sigma your way out of the laws of physics. If you compromise the integrity of the engineering, the reality will eventually catch up to the stock price. The complexity ceiling was reached when Boeing tried to make a 1960s plane act like a 2020s plane using nothing but a hidden line of code. So, the reason this legendary American company collapsed into a state of forensic investigation comes down to three things: the financialization of engineering decisions, the deliberate hiding of critical flight systems from regulators and pilots, and a catastrophic loss of manufacturing oversight through excessive outsourcing. Boeing was once the gold standard of the skies, but they traded their blueprint for a balance sheet. The result was a plane that wanted to fly one way and software that insisted it fly another, with the passengers caught in the middle. If you look at the landscape of global aviation now, you see the consequences. Airbus has taken a massive lead in market share, and new competitors from China and elsewhere are beginning to fill the void. Boeing is now forced to bring its Spirit Aerosystems wing back in-house, a multi-billion-dollar admission that their outsourcing strategy was a failure. The road back to safety is long, and it requires a return to the engineering-first mentality that built the 747 and the 777. But as we've seen, rebuilding a culture is much harder than rebuilding an engine. If you learned something new from this investigation into the blueprints of corporate greed, subscribe. Next, we're breaking down why the Concorde, the most advanced civilian aircraft ever built, was actually a financial and environmental dead end from the very first day it took flight. The underlying flaw in the economics of supersonic travel might surprise you. Every disaster, whether it's a crashed plane or a failed corporation, leaves a blueprint for us to study. We are here to decode those flaws so we don't repeat them. The autopsy of Boeing is far from over, but the lesson is already clear. In the world of engineering, there is no such thing as a minor shortcut. Next time you board a flight, remember that the most important part of the plane isn't the engine or the wing, it's the integrity of the people who designed it. See you in the next breakdown.